based on what I know about the Syrian war, the U.S. interests, the Qatar-Turkey pipeline, Ukraine, Gazprom, Russia's gas control into Western Europe, that it's more likely that the U.S. was sending resources to rebel factions. This is the kind of thing right here that I think should give people pause. Are you guys familiar with this?
No.
This was a scandal when in Syria there were particular groups. I'm not sure if it was ISIS or who this was, but you can take a look at this weapon firing out the back of a truck that says Mark Plumbing, and it's got an American phone number on it. And people were like, "How did a truck from I think it was from Michigan end up in Syria to be used by rebel forces?" Or let me see. I think I actually have the story here. If it'll load.
That's
it is
insane.
Not loading. There's the, what is it? Truck on the front line of Syria war. Here we go. Let's pull this one up. Is that it? There we go. Texas plumber's truck, Texas, not Michigan, traded in, ends up in Syria with terrorists.
Oh my gosh.
I have questions. Yeah.
Wow.
He traded his old F-250 last year. The truck went to auction, still wearing his name and phone number. Got his new vehicle. Fast forward to this week, his truck appeared on Twitter in a decidedly different role. How did this thing make it there? There's actually a straightforward explanation for how the truck ended there. Allegedly in Syria, the export market for the U.S., across the globe, cars, blah, blah, blah. The truck likely passed through numerous hands and ended up in a dealer's lot in Syria before Mark 1 had fully broken in the vehicle that replaces, blah, blah, blah. Hair trigger conspiracy theorists. Oh, come on, man. It's all a big accident that some Texas guy's truck made its way to Syria in the war. I'm going to give you a simple solution because I prefer Occam's razor. In the absence of evidence, the solution that makes the least amount of assumptions tends to be correct. Would we like to make the assumption that the truck was traded in, sold and put on the export market, was then auctioned off in a foreign country, that was then auctioned off in a foreign country, that was then auctioned off in a foreign country and found its way to Syria? Or how about we say, instead of making all those leaps, which is quite conspiratorial, we can just say someone in the U.S. gave it to Syria.
Yeah.
That's it. Now, if you want to speculate beyond that it was U.S. intentionally providing resources to rebel forces in Syria, we can then dive deeper and say the U.S. had a very, very powerful and vested interest in Assad crumbling and his government collapsing, which, of course, recently happened. So I'm going to go ahead and say, based on what I know about the Syrian war, the U.S. interests, the Qatar-Turkey pipeline, Ukraine, Gazprom, Russia's gas control into Western Europe, that it's more likely that the U.S. was sending resources to rebel factions. That's it.
What are we hoping to get out of it, though?
Syria?
Yeah.
We were trying to build a pipeline from it's called the Qatar-Turkey pipeline. There's a gas field that Iran and Iraq both have access to. And they wanted to build a pipeline that went through, I believe it was Iraq, Syria, Turkey, into Europe so that it would offset the Gazprom natural gas monopoly in Europe. The U.S. went to Syria and said, we would like to build this pipeline through your country. And Bashar al-Assad said, we are allies with Russia, and this would damage their economic interests. We're not going to let you do this. Of course, Russia has a naval base in Tartus. So the U.S. got angry and said, okay, fine, I guess, but we're upset because Gazprom controls about a quarter of natural gas flowing into Europe, meaning that Russia has an outsized ability to control the market prices. So what ends up happening next is Syria, Russia, and Iran have a discussion, and Iran says, look, we can tap the same gas field, send the pipeline through Iraq into Syria, Turkey, and then Russia doubles its control. The U.S. then said, yeah, if you do that, we will wipe you out. And back in, I think this was like 2009, the CIA had basically been discussing ways to get Assad out of power because of this problem. And then The Guardian reported, I think it was in 2012, the intention to overthrow the Assad regime was now apparent in the Beltway. People knew this was coming. And when the fighting started in the Arab Spring, this is basically where the reporting comes from, the U.S. had this vested interest in helping rebel factions overthrow their tyrannical government. Then you can take a look at the Burisma scandal. Why is it that the U.S. has a former counterterror director from the CIA working on the board of a gas company in Ukraine? Why does the U.S. want control in Ukraine? All of this is connected. The argument on the surface is that the U.S. is trying, or I should say NATO, is trying to get a hold on energy prices in Europe. Remember the riots in France over the price of petrol? Mm-hmm. The problem is that Russia does not care of Western interests and is going to charge what they charge. As the West has tried to negotiate better prices, Russia says, screw yourself. They're going to work with China. The argument is, and I don't know that I believe it, NATO wants to get energy prices down to allow rapid expansion in Europe to compete with the Chinese economic bloc. And Russia is basically blocking that because they're the ones who are dominant with energy. So when the U.S. tried going to Syria and say, we'll build our own pipeline, then Syria blocked them saying no, because we're friends with Russia. The U.S. was then like, well, then we have no choice because there's no, or I should say NATO again, or the U.S., whatever. We have no means of actually controlling prices and expanding the European economic bloc because you're barring our access. And you're now going to try and undercut us by going to Iran and having them tap our gas field. War. And here we are now. Syria's collapsed and Ukraine is at war. And that's completely obvious to anybody who's been tracking what's been going on with this stuff going back 12 years or longer. I remember back when it was, I think it was was it Wesley Clark? Is that the guy? He said there's 7 countries we're going to overthrow, and he started listing them off. Libya, and I think Syria is one of them, and there's Iran was one of them, I think, and so I don't know how many of them have eventually collapsed, but it is fascinating to me. Going back to 2012 during the Arab Spring, I think it was 2012 when The Guardian reported this, and all of my friends, I had friends who were doing field reporting in Syria and Turkey on the issue, and they were basically saying like, here's what's playing out. Russia controls a quarter of the gas through Gazprom. It's a pipeline that travels through Ukraine. The West wants to control either Ukraine or get a pipeline in because then they can basically force Russia to drop their prices. Sure enough, we get the Maidan movement. Sure enough, we end up in, 2021 when the war started?
Yeah.
Or was it 2020? Was it
2022? Yep.
Right when Biden gets back in, war kicks off. And it's funny because in the period that Donald Trump was president, everything started calming down. ISIS got obliterated. Things were starting to stabilize. Biden comes in. Everything starts falling apart once again. War erupts exactly where tons of people had predicted based on this energy issue. Now, a lot of people don't believe it's true that they're trying to offset prices to compete with China because the West is particularly deferential to China. And so it doesn't quite make sense that we need to compete with China when we've given over so much of our manufacturing and economic, stability to China in the first place. Then the question is, what exactly are these powerful governmental and corporate institutions actually doing? No idea. No idea. On the surface, you can take a look at Gazprom, Ukraine, Burisma, Syria, and all that, and see how it lines up. What the ultimate goal is, I don't know. If we want to go Occam's razor, then it really is simple. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline was strengthening Russia's control of natural gas delivery into Europe. Germany was basically saying, okay, Russia, we'll buy from you. The U.S. was saying, Germany, how dare you? Don't buy from them because that's empowering their economy, and we're trying to shut this down. So what happens? Well, according to, I think, Germany, they filed a lawsuit against a Ukrainian guy for blowing up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. When that happened, the Western media was claiming Russia blew up their own gas pipeline by dropping a bomb in it, which made no sense. And then the working theory among people
propped up Ukrainian that blew up the Nord Stream pipe.
People believe that it was actually CIA frogmen who went and blew up the Russian gas pipeline to limit Russia's ability to sell gas into Europe, which was strengthening their control and boosting their economy, as what they refer. And this is another reason. I mean, this is crazy. Crimea. Why did the U.S. want to secure Ukraine? Shut down Russia in Crimea because it's their only warm water port, which gives them access to from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, where they deliver oil. They have the Sevastopol naval station where their fleet is stationed. The U.S. Asking a Ukrainian guy to press the button, the U.S. gave the weapons and the intel to blow up the Russian flagship. Then you get these Democrats going, oh, come on, Russia has access to the Black Sea from other areas, not in Sevastopol. And it's like, sure, if they want to spend another $5 billion building a naval base. Anyway.
It makes no sense for them to have to want to blow up their own pipeline like that. Using that as the line of defense was laughable. I don't see how anybody could look at that and say, oh, yeah, Russia would want to hurt themselves like that, so they would want to blow up the Nord Stream pipeline. It made zero sense.
Has any Democrat given a legitimate reason as to why Russia invaded Ukraine?
No.
They just say things like, oh, he's like Hitler and he wants to steal the land.
That's the main narrative that they stick to. One thing that whenever we helped install Zelensky and after we removed the democratically elected president before Zelensky in Ukraine, one thing that USAID money use their power to enforce with all of these new media agencies that are now funded by USAID in Ukraine, 9 out of 10, was that they are not allowed to air any Russian talking people on the TVs in Ukraine, which is insane because a large percentage of the people in Ukraine speak Russian just as much as they speak Ukrainian. So that was one of the rules for them when they took over their media and told them how they could do it. They used their money and power, USAID money, to tell them you cannot speak Russian on television.
When I was in Kiev, everyone I met spoke Ukrainian and Russian. And
When was this?
this was end of 2013 and beginning of 2014.
Wow, you were right there before the coup.
That was the start. That was the Euromaidan protests, and I got to see the Lenin statue they ripped down. And I ended up leaving, and then there was another crew that went into Yanukovych's house. It's crazy. Yeah, the overthrowing of this dude. He fled to Russia, but most of the people I met spoke Russian, and a handful spoke Ukrainian, Russian, and Polish.
Wow.
I mean, my understanding is the languages are relatively similar, but in this area, you're bumping into a lot of these people. But the Russian thing was interesting because what I was told that in the East, particularly like the Donbass region, everyone there spoke Russian primarily. Mm-hmm. Though they could speak Ukrainian, their first language was Russian, and they interacted quite a bit across the border.
Well, let me ask you this. What do you think would be a fair negotiation for a peace deal with Russia right now if Trump couldn't negotiate one?
It's tough. Russia should not have invaded. The U.S. was using soft power. And my view is international conflict is going to happen. I know that kinetic war does happen. But what the U.S. was doing was soft power. And that's preferable to hot war. So if the U.S. is basically saying we are going to fund special interests and Russia's getting mad about it and they're losing that fight, that's the fight I would prefer to have over people blowing each other up and Ukraine being turned into nuclear sludge. That being said, I don't know the structure by which anything else could happen. I don't think that there's one guy who's sitting there twirling his mustache and then, doing the pinky thing saying, we're going to take Ukraine. It's a bunch of different interests. And there's a probability. If one guy says, we need cheaper energy, another guy says, we need cheaper energy, another guy says, we're being blocked by Ukraine. It's not that one guy stands up and directs the armies to go and invade Ukraine. It's that special interests across the board start putting pressure in this area. So, I mean, it's complicated. And that's what I'm trying to say is probabilistically what was happening in Ukraine with soft power was going to happen no matter what, whether the U.S. wanted it to or not, because all of the business interests, political interests of the West were aligned towards getting cheaper energy and were pissed off at Russia. So it's a bad thing. As to what should happen now, I wouldn't be opposed personally. This means very little. I am not an expert on the region, nor am I a politician, nor should I be. But at this point, it should simply be the war is over. That's just it. Literally, the war stops. Russia, you stop where you are. Russia's going to secure a land bridge to Crimea. The fact that Ukraine could go join NATO means that the only real way that this stops is, well, there's a couple ways. Russia is flattened and Putin is wiped out in hellfire, or the land bridge through the Donbass region down through like Mariupol and everything to Crimea is maintained and secured and becomes Russian. The rest of Ukraine remains Ukraine, but this means that Russia has no interest in moving beyond those borders because Crimea, where they have the Sevastopol port, which is like a near $1 billion port, is now firmly under their control. If they don't, the simple explanation for why they invaded is that it looks at, or first, let's go back to the seizure of Crimea. How did they seize Crimea? Literally, they walked out of the Sevastopol base and says, here we are, we're in your territory. So we can make the argument the referendum was fake and that the people there didn't actually vote in favor of Russia, maybe, but the troops were already there. It's not like they invaded Ukraine, stormed Crimea, and seized this territory. They literally were there. They want to stay there because they have infrastructure there. They have their naval base. Look, if they lose Sevastopol, tons of their intel, technology, plans falls into the hands of NATO. They're never going to let that happen. The only access they had to Crimea was an actual physically built bridge, which, of course, we saw was bombed by Ukrainian forces, NATO. So Russia is invading Ukraine principally to secure land access into Crimea. They've taken it. They now control that whole strip going down into Crimea, as well as the physical bridge. They don't need anything else. If Trump negotiates, you keep that access. The rest of Ukraine stays where it is. There's no reason for any more fighting with Russia. Russia will not need to advance. They will have secure access to Crimea and their port. The fighting's over. If Trump comes in and says, we are going to repel you and push you out of this territory and restore Ukraine to its full sovereignty, Russia's going to say, we won't lose Sevastopol. It's not going to happen. So I think the most likely scenario is the fighting just stops where it is and the current drawn borders stay where they are. But again, it means very little coming from me, and I have no idea. Thanks for watching this clip from the Culture War podcast. We're live every Friday, 10 a.m. to noon. So subscribe and come hang out.